Welcome to Interviews from the Grave, where history gets a second mic. I'm your host, Mort. Every week I pull someone back, because they still have something the world needs to hear. We would really appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe, and share this interview. And now, tonight's guest was 46 years old when a single shot changed the course of history. A war hero, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the youngest man ever elected to the presidency, and the one who looked a nation in the eye and told them the best was still ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, John F. Kennedy.
It's an honor to be here, Mort. Thank you for having me.
Over 1,000 books have been written about your assassination. The Warren Commission has been widely criticized, and documents are still being declassified to this day. So, who do you think was behind it? Was it the CIA, the mob, LBJ, Castro, or was Oswald truly a lone wolf?
You know, I have thought about this question, or rather I have had the unusual luxury of having thought about it from a perspective that no other man has ever had. And I want to be careful because there is a temptation when answering something like this to be reckless, to point fingers, to reduce something that was, whatever it was, to a villain in a story. History deserves better than that. And frankly, so does the truth. Let me begin with what I know. I was in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963. I was riding through Dealey Plaza. The sun was out, Jackie was beside me, the crowds were warmer than I had expected given what my advisors had told me about Texas. And then everything changed in an instant. What I experienced in those final moments is not something I choose to dwell on here, but I will say this. No man who has felt that kind of sudden absolute finality comes away from it believing in simple answers. Now, to your question, Lee Harvey Oswald, I will say that I have never believed that one man acting entirely alone with a bolt-action rifle from a sixth-floor window produced the precise result that was achieved in Dealey Plaza. The physics of it troubled me then when I first understood what had happened. The angle of the shots, the so-called single bullet, these things strained credulity. The Warren Commission did its best under enormous political pressure, but it was designed as much to reassure a frightened nation as it was to pursue the truth. And those are not always the same mission. Now, am I going to sit here and name names? No, I am not. And I want you to understand why, because the moment I point at a specific man or a specific agency, I become the instrument of exactly the kind of recklessness that I spent my presidency trying to prevent. What I can tell you is this: there were people, powerful people, who wanted me gone. Not because they hated me personally, though some of them did, but because of what I represented, what I was moving toward. I had, by the autumn of 1963, begun to fundamentally reconsider the posture of the United States toward the Soviet Union. NSAM 263, National Security Action Memorandum 263, directed the withdrawal of American military personnel from Vietnam, not a slow drawdown, a withdrawal. I was not going to send 100,000 American boys into a jungle war that I did not believe we could win and that I did not believe served our long-term interests. That decision made me enemies, serious enemies in the military establishment and the intelligence community, and among those who had a financial and ideological stake in the continuation of that conflict. I had also, through back channels, begun a quiet and very tentative conversation with Nikita Khrushchev about the possibility of a joint lunar mission, a shared endeavor. I know how that sounds now. It sounded remarkable then, too. But I genuinely believed that competition alone would not sustain civilization, that there had to be moments where adversaries chose a different path. The speech I gave at American University in June of '63, I meant every word of that speech. And there were men in this country who viewed that speech as something close to treason. So when you ask me who was behind it, I think you are really asking, was there institutional involvement? Were there people within the American government or connected to it who either planned this or allowed it to happen or looked the other way when they had information that might have prevented it? And my honest answer is that I believe the answer to at least some part of that question is yes. I do not know the precise architecture of it. I do not have a diagram, but I know what I was doing. I know who it threatened, and I know that the Oswald, whatever he was, did not act in a vacuum. As for Castro, no. I do not believe Fidel Castro ordered my assassination. That would have been an act of extraordinary recklessness on his part. He was many things, stubborn, theatrical, ideologically rigid, but he was not reckless. He knew that killing an American president would bring the full weight of this country down on Cuba within 48 hours. He wasn't suicidal. And LBJ, I want to be thoughtful here. Lyndon was a complicated man. He was ambitious in ways that sometimes frightened even him. But there is a difference between a man who benefits from a tragedy and a man who engineered it. I am not prepared to make that accusation. Not here, not without evidence I do not possess. What I will say is this, and I say it not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from distance. The truth about Dallas was inconvenient for too many powerful people for it ever to be allowed to fully surface. The documents that are still being withheld after more than 60 years, you have to ask yourself why. What could possibly still be sensitive enough 60 years later to keep from the American people? The answer to that question tells you more than any commission ever could. I did not want to die. I had work left to do. I believed we were on the edge of something, a different kind of America, a different kind of world. And whatever happened in Dealey Plaza, that possibility died with me. That, perhaps, is the real answer to your question.
60 years of sealed documents. And you just told me the truth was inconvenient for too many powerful people to ever surface. I'm not going to pretend that didn't just land. Now, the world knew the leader. I want to talk about the man. The public didn't know about your affairs with Marilyn Monroe, mob connections, or the full extent of your health struggles while in office. Does the Camelot myth bother you, or did you build it deliberately?
Well, I suppose I should begin by saying that I am not entirely surprised by the question, and I am not going to pretend to be offended by it. One of the few genuine advantages of having had the time I have had to reflect is that you lose the capacity for false indignation. Things either matter or they do not, and the truth, however uncomfortable, always matters more than the image. Let me address the personal first, because I think it is the least important, and yet it is always what people want to discuss. Yes, I was unfaithful to my wife, more than once. More than the public ever knew during my lifetime, and perhaps more than they fully appreciate even now. I am not going to stand here and explain it away or dress it up in the language of the era. The honest answer is that I was deeply flawed in that particular domain of my life, and Jackie bore the cost of those flaws in ways that she never deserved. She was a remarkable woman, more remarkable in many ways than the myth of Camelot ever captured. The question you were really asking is whether I feel bothered by the gap between the image and the reality, and I want to distinguish between two very different kinds of image management. There is the kind that is essentially fraudulent, where a man presents himself as something he is not in order to deceive the people on matters that directly affect their welfare. That kind of deception corrodes democracy. And then there is the kind where a president carefully manages the presentation of his office in order to maintain the authority and stability necessary to govern effectively. Those are not the same thing. My health was a genuine case where the line was complicated. I had Addison's disease. I had severe back pain that at times was genuinely debilitating. The medications I took were significant, and we kept all of it from the public. Now, was that right? I have gone back and forth on this. The argument for disclosure is obvious. The American people have a right to know whether their president is physically capable of performing the duties of his office. But the argument on the other side is also serious. A president who is visibly weakened is a president whose adversaries will test. Khrushchev already believed after Vienna that he was dealing with a young man he could push around. That perception nearly ended the world during the missile crisis. Strength, or at least the credible projection of it, is not vanity in that office. It is a tool of diplomacy. Now, the Camelot framing, that came largely from Jackie in the weeks after my death. The Lerner and Loa musical, the idea that we had been for one brief and shining moment a kind of golden age. I understand why she did it. She was protecting her children. She was processing her grief. I am grateful for her loyalty, but I will be honest with you, I am not entirely comfortable with it, because Camelot implies perfection, and there were plenty of shadows. What bothers me most about the sanitized version is not that it makes me look better than I was. It is that it makes the work look easier than it was. The missile crisis was not handled smoothly or gracefully in the early hours. There were men in that room pushing for a military strike that I believe would have triggered a nuclear exchange. The decisions I made were hard, and they were made under conditions of genuine uncertainty and fear. The mythology flattens all of that into something almost decorative, and there is a political cost to mythology. When a leader becomes a symbol rather than a man, the lesson of his leadership becomes inaccessible. Young people who might learn from what I actually did are instead handed a poster, a glamorous couple in a rose garden, and that does not teach anyone anything. So do I wish the record were more complete? Yes. Do I think the American people could have handled the truth about my health, my personal failings, the full complexity of the political decisions I made? Yes, I do. I underestimated the public in some of those decisions, and I regret it. Not because the image was unpleasant, it was by any measure a very flattering image, but because a democracy runs on reality, not mythology, and we owe the people we serve the respect of the truth.
A man who calls his own mythology a disservice to democracy. That's not what I expected. You protected the image because the world needed steadiness. But you're telling me the image outlasted the lesson. Let's go somewhere harder. Vietnam. One man on a submarine. That's the detail that stays with you. You didn't win the missile crisis, Mr. President. You survived it. And you're the only one at that table who seems to know the difference. Now, the world knew the leader. Let's talk about the myth. Many historians argue you were planning to pull out of Vietnam before your death, while others say you were doubling down. Knowing what we know now about that war's outcome, what was your true intention, and do you carry any guilt?
Let me settle the historical debate first, because it matters. I was going to withdraw from Vietnam. That is not a retrospective reinterpretation. NSAM 263, signed in October of 1963, called for the withdrawal of 1,000 American military personnel by the end of that year, and a complete withdrawal of the bulk of American personnel by the end of 1965. That was the policy. It was signed. It was real. My critics say that I was simply managing the politics of withdrawal, that I would have escalated after the 1964 election just as Lyndon did. My defenders sometimes overstate the case in the other direction. The honest answer is somewhere between those two poles, but much closer to the withdrawal end of the spectrum. I had been briefed extensively on Vietnam since taking office. I had sent General Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow there in 1961, and when they came back and told me we needed combat troops, I pushed back. I sent advisors, not combat troops. That distinction mattered to me enormously. I had read the history of the French experience in Indochina. I understood that this was a nationalist struggle first and an ideological struggle second. You cannot defeat a people fighting for their own land. I had also been deeply shaped by my experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis and by Laos early in my administration, another situation where my military advisors were pushing for direct intervention and I resisted. Each time you resist that pressure and find a different path, you become more certain that the pressure itself is the problem. Would I have escalated after the '64 election if I had lived? I do not believe so. By the autumn of '63, I had privately concluded that the DM government was not salvageable. You cannot build a democratic bulwark against communism on a foundation that the population does not legitimately support. The entire premise of the intervention was flawed. The guilt question is the harder one. When I was killed, there were 16,000 American military advisors in Vietnam. Some of them died, some of them came home wounded. I bear responsibility for those men being there, and there is a larger guilt, the guilt of what came after. 58,000 American names on a wall in Washington, millions of Vietnamese dead. I did not cause all of that. But I also know that the infrastructure of American involvement was something I built and maintained. What would I have done differently? I would have been more honest with the American people earlier about the fundamental problems with the mission. I operated on the assumption that the public could not handle a president who said, this is a situation where there are no good options. I should have said it anyway. I would also have moved faster. The bureaucratic caution that led me to sign NSAM 263 in October rather than in January. That caution cost time and it cost lives. When you know the right thing to do, the political calendar is not a sufficient reason to delay it. There are men who came home from that war who deserved better from their government. That is the weight I carry, not the decisions I made, but the decisions that were made in my name after I was gone. History has a way of assigning responsibility broadly, and I accept my share of it. But I want the record to be clear. The war that destroyed a generation of Americans was not the war I intended. It was the war that replaced me.
58,000 names on a wall you didn't build, but you're carrying them anyway. Let's talk about the one that almost ended everything before Vietnam ever could. You stared down the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis and arguably prevented World War III. Now there are 9 nuclear-armed nations, a resurgent Russia, and a nuclear North Korea. How close are we to the edge compared to what you faced?
You know, when people use the phrase stared down the Soviets, it creates an impression of that 13-day period that is both heroic and misleading. We did not stare anyone down. We found, with enormous difficulty and not a little luck, a way out of a situation that could have ended civilization as we know it. There is nothing heroic about luck. Let me tell you something that was not widely known for many years afterward. At the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was operating near the naval quarantine line. It had lost contact with Moscow. Its officers believed war had already begun. They had a nuclear torpedo. The captain wanted to fire it. There was a political officer on board named Vasily Arkhipov who refused to authorize the launch. One man. We have since learned that if that torpedo had been fired, escalation would have been automatic and the strategic nuclear exchange would have followed within hours. One man saved the world. I tell you that story because when you ask me how close we are today to the edge compared to what I faced, I want you to understand that what I faced was closer to that edge than almost anyone in the public understood, and the margin of safety was not strategy or strength or resolve. It was one Soviet naval officer on a submarine in the Caribbean. The proliferation of nuclear weapons to 9 states, including North Korea, is in some ways more dangerous than the bipolar world I navigated. It is more dangerous because the command and control structures in some of those nations are less reliable, less tested, and in some cases far less rational than the Soviet system was. Khrushchev was not suicidal. He understood at a visceral level what destruction on a mass scale actually meant. Russia today troubles me deeply. The Russia I dealt with was a state actor with legible interest. What I see in Russia now, the nationalist grievance, the imperial nostalgia, the willingness to use nuclear language as a routine instrument of coercion, that is something different. That is a system where the internal logic has become partly detached from the external reality. The most dangerous thing in nuclear strategy is not aggression, it is miscalculation, and the conditions for that failure mode are, I think, significantly more prevalent today than they were in 1962. What I find most alarming is the degradation of the institutional architecture that was built after my death to reduce these risks. The nuclear test ban treaty that I negotiated in 1963, I was proud of that. The arms control frameworks that followed are now in various stages of collapse or suspension. That is not progress. That is dangerous regression. You ask how close we are to the edge. I think we are closer than most people believe. The reason we are closer is not that the weapons are more powerful. It is that the systems of communication, the habits of restraint, the personal relationships between leaders, all of the things that actually prevented nuclear war in 1962 have atrophied. Deterrence is not a strategy. It is a hope. And hope requires maintenance. If I had one thing to say to the leaders of today's nuclear powers, it would be this: talk to each other, directly, privately, about what you are afraid of. Because in my experience, the most dangerous moments are the ones where each side is acting on a misreading of the other's intentions. In the fall of 1962, we came within one naval officer of finding out what happens when that misreading is not corrected in time.
One naval officer. That's the margin between us and oblivion. You're telling me deterrence is a hope, not a strategy, and that the maintenance on that hope has lapsed. That's a hard thing to sit with. Now, from the edge of the world to the soul of a nation. Your era is romanticized as a golden age of American optimism, ambition, and unity, a country that was going to put a man on the moon. Do you believe something was fundamentally lost after your presidency?
I want to resist the nostalgia in this question because nostalgia is one of the most politically dangerous emotions there is. Every generation believes that the one before it was more coherent, more purposeful, more united. The 1960s were not a golden age of unity. They were a decade of profound and sometimes violent division over civil rights, over Vietnam, over the fundamental question of who this country was for. And I was part of that division. My administration moved more slowly on civil rights than it should have. I was cautious, too cautious, in the face of the moral clarity that Martin King and the movement were providing. History has judged that caution, and I think history is right to have done so. What was real in that period was a sense that government could be an instrument of human progress, that a democratic society could decide to do something ambitious and difficult and actually accomplish it. The Moon program was the purest expression of that. When I stood at Rice University and said, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard, that was a statement about the kind of country I believed we could be. And I think something of that did get lost, not on November 22nd, 1963, but through the accumulated weight of what followed. Vietnam broke the covenant between the government and the governed in a way that I am not sure has ever been fully repaired. Watergate deepened that wound. The combination of Vietnam and Watergate produced a generation that learned with justification that their government would lie to them about matters of life and death. That lesson became embedded in the culture. Now, is America in decline? I am reluctant to use that phrase because it implies a trajectory that I am not certain is as fixed as the declinist argument suggests. There have been moments where I have thought, yes, something essential has been lost, the capacity for collective sacrifice, the willingness to trust that an imperfect institution can still be worth defending and improving. What I see in today's political life is a kind of recursive cynicism. People are cynical about government because government has given them reasons to be cynical. And because they are cynical, they disengage. And because they disengage, the people who are left to run the institutions are less accountable to the public interest. That cycle is genuinely alarming. But I also see young people who are engaged in ways that would have astonished me. That is not decline, that is democracy working at its most fundamental level. Here is what I believe about America, and it is what I believed in 1963, and it is what I believe now. This country's greatest periods have not been the ones of greatest comfort or unity. They have been the ones of greatest effort. The question is always whether you can find the thing worth organizing around. Has something been lost since November of '63? Yes, the specific possibility of that moment is gone and cannot be recovered. But loss is not the same as decline. And the country I love is still capable of the kind of effort I believed it could achieve. It simply needs to be reminded from time to time what it is capable of.
Loss is not the same as decline. I'm going to remember that one. You're still betting on the American people, even from here. Let's test that instinct against something more specific. 2 wars fought in your name after your time. You were hawkish on communism, but skeptical of nation-building and open-ended military commitments. If 9/11 had happened on your watch, would you have invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, or taken a completely different approach?
This is the question that requires me to be most careful because I am being asked to speculate about a hypothetical that involves events and context so far removed from my own experience. I did not live through the Cold War's end. I did not see the rise of the particular form of jihadist extremism that produced the attacks of September 11th. So I want to be honest about the limits of what I can say. What I can speak to with confidence is the framework through which I would have analyzed those events, the instincts, the historical analogies, the institutional knowledge that I brought to every foreign policy question. On Afghanistan specifically, the direct response to an attack of that magnitude on American soil, I think a military response was probably unavoidable, and I might well have authorized one. I was not a pacifist. I believed in American power and in its legitimate use in defense of American lives and interests. But I would have been relentlessly focused on the specific objective: destroy the organization's operational capacity, remove the sanctuary, do not stay. Mancho, nation building in Afghanistan, creating a democratic, Western-oriented state in a country whose entire political and social structure is organized around tribal, regional, and religious loyalties, that I would have viewed with profound skepticism from the beginning. Democracy cannot be installed like a piece of machinery. It grows, or it does not grow, from conditions that a foreign military occupation is singularly ill-suited to create. Iraq is a different matter entirely. The case for invading Iraq in 2003 rested on the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and represented an imminent threat. The strategic logic was flawed on its face. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but brutal dictators are not, as a category, best addressed by invasion and regime change. They are addressed through containment, through inspection regimes, through coalition pressure. More fundamentally, what comes after. You remove a dictator who has held together an ethnically and religiously fractured state by force. What fills the vacuum? The chaos that followed regime change in Baghdad was not unpredictable. It was predicted. I would not have invaded Iraq. I am as certain of that as I can be of anything in this domain of speculation. Not because I was unwilling to use military force, I was willing, but because the strategic calculus was wrong. The objective was not clearly defined. The post-conflict planning was non-existent. And the underlying premise that American military power could reshape the Middle East into a more democratic, more pro-American configuration reflected a hubris about the limits of power that my entire political education had taught me to distrust. Power has limits. That is not defeatism, it is realism. And a president who does not understand the limits of his country's power will eventually find those limits for him, at a cost borne not by the president, but by the young men and women in uniform and by the civilians in the countries where that power is projected. The greatest failure of leadership is the failure to ask before committing to a course of action, and then what?
And then what? 2 words that might have saved 100,000 lives. Power has limits, and you're saying the real failure was refusing to ask that question before it was too late. One more. And this one's personal. Politics in your day had its own corruption and theater, but there was a certain gravitas to the office. Looking at the current media environment, social media, 24-hour news cycles, polarization, do you think a leader like you could even exist today, or would you have been destroyed before you ever got started?
I want to answer your underlying question directly, and then I want to push back on part of its premise. My era had plenty of its own degradations, the smears, the whisper campaigns, the backroom dealing, the outright corruption. These were not invented after I left. They were the texture of American political life long before television, let alone social media. The specific environment that today's political leaders operate in is genuinely different. The most significant difference is the compression of time. In my era, a president could make a decision, absorb information, consult with advisors, actually think, and then communicate that decision in a measured way. That pause has been entirely eliminated. What you have now is a media environment that demands a response to every development within minutes. And that response is then immediately subjected to analysis, counter-response, and amplification. A leader who is perpetually in reaction mode is a leader who cannot develop strategy. Strategy requires time. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty. The social media question is one I find genuinely fascinating. In principle, that ought to be democratizing. But the press, for all its flaws, performed a function that is not replaceable by any technology. It created some friction between a leader's impulse and its public expression. Friction is valuable. The absence of friction is not freedom. It is a very efficient delivery system for whatever is most raw and least considered. Could I exist today? I think the honest answer is I would have had to become a fundamentally different kind of politician, and I am not certain I would have been willing to do that. The particular combination of qualities that allowed me to function, the ability to project warmth publicly while maintaining a private analytical coldness, the comfort with ambiguity and complexity, those qualities are not well suited to an environment that rewards certainty and punishes nuance. What troubles me most about the state of political leadership today is the breakdown of the infrastructure of seriousness. The shared assumption that governing was difficult, that expertise mattered, that the world was complicated, and that a person in high office owed the public their best effort to understand that complication. That assumption is not universally held today. The question of whether leadership can recover its gravity is really a question about whether the public still demands gravity from its leaders, because leaders in a democracy ultimately reflect the demands of the people who elect them. If the public rewards theater over substance, anger over analysis, certainty over complexity, leaders will provide theater, anger, and false certainty. I believed in the American people. I believed they were capable of more than they were sometimes given credit for, and I still do. The capacity is there. The question is always whether it can be activated, whether some leader in some moment can find the language and the vision to call it forward. That has happened before in this country. There is no reason it cannot happen again. Lime eeks.
The infrastructure of seriousness, that's what's gone. Not the leaders, the expectation of them. You're saying we got the politics we asked for. That's a harder indictment than anything you could say about any one man. Speaking of which, let's talk about the man. You governed during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. Looking at the current administration, the politics, the division, the style of leadership, what is your honest assessment?
Well, that is a question that requires both candor and restraint, and I shall try to offer both. I watch the affairs of our republic from a distance that no living man can fully comprehend, yet with an interest that has never dimmed. The office I once held remains the most powerful position on earth, and the man who occupies it carries burdens that would test any soul. The weight of decisions that can shape the lives of millions, the security of the nation, and the direction of history, that weight does not grow lighter with time. As for the current president and his administration, I will say this: leadership in our time has become a far more difficult craft than it was in mine. The world moves faster, the voices are louder and more numerous, the divisions run deeper than perhaps any period I can recall in our history, and the machinery of politics, with its 24-hour news cycles and its constant demand for spectacle, rewards sharpness and certainty far more than nuance or patience. I do not envy the task before him. What I see is a country still wrestling with many of the same fundamental questions we faced more than 60 years ago. Questions of power and restraint, of unity and division, of how a free people can remain both secure in a dangerous world and true to their founding ideals. Some of those questions are being met with energy and conviction. I see efforts to strengthen the economy, to address the challenges of a rapidly changing world, and to protect American interests abroad, where those efforts are rooted in prudence rather than recklessness, where they seek to build rather than merely to tear down. They deserve recognition. Yet I also see something that concerns me, a kind of reflexive partisanship that seems to treat half the nation as the enemy rather than as fellow citizens, a tendency to govern by grievance instead of by vision. When leadership allows bitterness or tribal loyalty to widen the fractures in our society, it solves very little and deepens the wound. I learned sometimes at painful cost that the true measure of a president is not the volume of his rhetoric or the sharpness of his attacks upon his opponents. It is the capacity to bring a divided house together, to speak to what Lincoln so eloquently called the better angels of our nature, and to pursue policies that endure beyond the next election cycle or the next news cycle. I was never one to shrink from strong action when the nation's vital interests demanded it. During the missile crisis, we faced the very real possibility of annihilation, and we chose resolve paired with restraint. We did not rush to the edge and dare the other side to blink. We found a path that preserved peace without sacrificing honor. That kind of measured strength, the ability to be firm without being reckless, is what I believe the times still require. This administration, like every administration before it, has its achievements and its missteps, where it has moved to protect American workers, to confront genuine threats from abroad, or to invest in the future of our country with foresight. Those steps merit praise. But where it has chosen easy applause over difficult truths, where it has allowed division to become a permanent feature of our politics rather than a problem to be solved, I would counsel greater care. The presidency is not a prize to be won and then used as a weapon against half the country. It is a sacred trust, a temporary stewardship of something far larger than any one man or any one party. I believed in 1961, as I believe now, that the American people are capable of more than they are sometimes asked to give. They respond best when called to their highest selves, to their ingenuity, their resilience, their generosity of spirit. When a president speaks as though the nation is irreparably broken, or when he governs primarily by stoking fear and resentment, he underestimates the very people he was elected to serve. The Republic does not thrive on cynicism. It thrives on confidence in our institutions when they deserve it, and confidence in our ability to improve them when they fall short. In the end, no single administration can redeem or ruin the Republic. That work belongs to all of us, to the Congress, to the courts, to the states, and above all to the people themselves. What matters most in any moment is whether the leadership of the day calls forth the best in the American character or allows the worst instincts to prevail. I pray that this administration and every administration that follows chooses the harder and higher path, because the Republic I loved and still love is capable of greatness when it chooses to be. It has done so before in times of trial and uncertainty far greater than many imagine. It can do so again if we remember that what unites us as Americans is far more powerful than what divides us, and if we demand from our leaders the same courage, the same vision, and the same sense of responsibility that this office has always required. The American experiment remains the boldest and most hopeful in human history. It deserves leaders who understand that and who govern accordingly.
Govern by grievance instead of vision. You said it quietly, but that one landed. You're not indicting a party. You're indicting a posture. And somehow, from wherever you are, you still sound like you believe we can do better. One last question, Mr. President. And this one isn't about policy. Last question, Mr. President. If you could speak directly to the American people today, not as a politician, not as a legend, just as a citizen who loved this country, what would you say?
My fellow Americans, if I could speak to you today across the years that separate us, I would do so not with the voice of a ghost, but with the voice of a citizen who still believes deeply in this republic and in its possibilities. I would begin by reminding you of what has always been true. You are the heirs of a great and difficult experiment. An experiment that declares that ordinary men and women can govern themselves, that liberty and responsibility can walk hand in hand, and that a nation can be both powerful and just. That experiment has never been easy. It was not easy in my time, and I know it is not easy in yours, but it remains the most noble endeavor in the story of mankind. York sows. Do not allow the noise and division of the moment to convince you that the country is finished or that its best days are behind it. I have seen darker hours. I have seen a world on the brink of nuclear annihilation. I have seen hatred and fear tested against courage and reason. And I learned then what I would tell you now. America does not decline because the challenges are great. America declines only if we lose faith in ourselves and in one another. I would urge you to reject the counsels of despair and the merchants of grievance. The problems you face, economic uncertainty, technological upheaval, deep political division, threats from abroad are real. They demand serious answers and steady hands, but they are not beyond your capacity to solve. You have overcome greater tests before. You put men on the moon when the task seemed impossible. You rebuilt Europe after the greatest war in history. You extended the blessings of liberty to more of your citizens even when powerful voices said it could not be done. That spirit, that American spirit, has not vanished. It has only been waiting to be called forth again. To the young people especially, I would say this: do not surrender to cynicism. Do not believe that politics is only theater or that public service is only for the corrupt. Your generation has more tools, more knowledge, and more power to shape the future than any that came before you. Use them. Organize, debate, demand better from your leaders, and then prepare yourselves to become those leaders. The unfinished work of our democracy still needs your hands, your minds, and your hearts. To all Americans, I would ask you to remember that unity is not the absence of disagreement. It is the recognition that we are all passengers on the same ship, and that if the ship founders, we all go down together. Disagree vigorously about policy. Argue about the best path forward. But never forget that the person on the other side of the aisle or the other side of the screen is still your countryman. He or she loves this country too, even if their vision of it differs from yours. Guard your institutions, but do not worship them. They were made by imperfect men to serve a noble purpose. When they fall short, reform them. When they grow arrogant, check them. But never abandon the idea that self-government, however messy, is still better than any alternative yet devised by man. And finally, I would leave you with this. The future does not belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to those who believe in it, who work for it, and who are willing to sacrifice for it. In my time, we set out to land a man on the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Today, the challenges may be different. Climate and technology, justice and prosperity, peace in a dangerous world. But the principle remains the same. Choose to do the hard things. Choose to reach for what is just and what is possible. I did not want to leave you when I did. There was work still unfinished. But if my life taught me anything, it is that no man is indispensable. The republic endures. The dream endures. And as long as you, the American people, continue to believe in it and fight for it, this nation will continue to be what it has always been at its best, a light to the world and a hope for mankind. Let us go forward together, confident in our cause, clear in our purpose, and faithful to the great unfinished work that remains before us. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you so much, sir. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, ladies and gentlemen. People argue about the greatest president this country has ever produced. After tonight, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. What I will say is this: the man came back, told the truth, and left us with more than we came with. These are interviews from the grave. Like, subscribe, and if this one stayed with you, share it. I'm Mort. I'll see you on the other side.